Hey, this is Pastor Matt. We are in John chapter 20. We've been reading through a chapter a day, 21 days at home with John. And so we're getting really close to the end. Lots of exciting stuff. A bunch of different things happen in chapter 20. So let's jump right into it. Now, it opens with Easter morning. It's the resurrection. And the women come back with this report of Jesus' body being missing. And you might ask the question, if you're familiar with the other gospel accounts, well, wait a second. Didn't these women meet an angel? Wasn't something said to them? Where's that part of the story? John doesn't report that. And I think it's helpful to remember a lot of what John tells us comes from John's perspective as he lived it out. And who is it that runs to the tomb after the women come? Well, it's Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, which is a reference to the author here, John. And so, from his perspective, these women come back and he hears something about the body being missing, and maybe they see some other stuff, but he doesn't really catch it. What he and Peter catch is Jesus' body is missing, something's happened. They run to the tomb, and of course, John lets us know that he got there first. So he outran Peter, which you can imagine, like years later, he's still telling the story and saying, "Yeah, and by the way, y'all think big of Peter, but I was a little faster than him that day." John gets there. He pauses. He sees the linens there, the burial cloths that had covered Jesus' body, and no body, and he stops at the door. And Peter, being Peter, kind of barrels on in, and he doesn't stop at the doorway at all. He goes in, then he sees it, and then John enters. And John tells us this. He tells us that in that moment, he believed. And he also says that he didn't really understand yet. He believed, but he didn't understand. I think that is so helpful for us in understanding what faith actually is and what belief is. And remember, a theme in John's gospel is this idea of believing. He writes so we can believe. He tells stories so we can believe. Jesus did signs throughout this gospel so that we could believe. John says he believed, but he didn't understand. And that, in essence, is what belief is. If belief is faith, it means taking as true something that I don't completely grasp, I don't completely understand. I can grow in my understanding. I can grow in how I know these things. But belief is something just a little bit different from that knowledge and that understanding that comes up here. And this belief, John says, in that moment, I believed. And then we switch scenes and we get this Mary Magdalene moment, and she meets these angels and it looks like she has no clue who she's talking to, because then she talks to Jesus. She still has no clue who she's talking to. When it dawns on her, what I want to point out here is being, at the time especially, in that culture, being a woman, being one who was cured of demon possession, Mary Magdalene is the least likely person to be an Easter morning messenger. But just as those other women were the first ones to tell the disciples, so too, she's chosen. Jesus sends her back. And if you notice with Peter and John, it says they go back to their homes. But Mary goes back and tells the other disciples that she has met Jesus, that Jesus is alive. She may be the least likely, but she was chosen for that role, which really sets up that next section where Jesus shows up among his disciples. He shows up, and I want you to think about it this way. He shows up among his church, his people. And he says, just as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. And that's a word not just for those 12, but for us, for his church. Just as the Father has sent Jesus, so he is sending you and me. He is sending us, just like he chose Mary Magdalene, one of the least likely. He chooses her. And throughout this gospel, we've seen that least likely be chosen to be close to Jesus. Whether it was Nicodemus, one of the religious leaders who were on Jesus' case, right? Or the Samaritan woman, who's not only a Samaritan, not only a woman, but she's also been married several times, and who knows if she's divorced or widowed or whatever. We see it with the woman caught in adultery. It's the least likely that Jesus chooses to spend time with. And now he chooses to send with a message of hope and of love and of God's grace. And he doesn't just send us in our own power or in our own way. He sends us empowered with the Holy Spirit, because it says that he breathes on his followers, right? Which that Greek word for breath is the same word for wind. It's the same word for spirit. So does he breathe on them? Does he spirit on them? Yes, he does. Okay. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness, it is withheld, because you actually do the Spirit's work. The Spirit works through you now. You don't control the Spirit. We talked about that. That goes back to chapter 3. You don't control the Spirit, so you don't dictate where forgiveness comes and where forgiveness doesn't come, but you announce it, and the Spirit announces God's work through you. And so he will do that because you're chosen, because you are the least of these, but chosen by God for this purpose and to be part of his church, which carries out these things. And not everyone gets it because Thomas doesn't get it, right? Not everyone is going to believe because, yeah, even one of Jesus' 12 is like, no, I can't believe this. It's too much unless I actually see, unless I actually touch, unless I actually feel. And Jesus shows up, right? And he invites Thomas and he says, do not disbelieve, but believe. Stop denying faith and begin believing, Thomas. That's Jesus' goal, and that's John's goal in writing as well. And Jesus has this beautiful statement, right? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And John uses that statement of Jesus to transition to those final verses of the chapter and really a purpose for writing his book, where he says, now Jesus did a whole bunch of other things, right? In the presence of his disciples. They were witnessed and we saw them, and they're not written in this book. But these, the stories that we've talked about, the stories that I've written down for you, they are written so that you may believe. So that you might be among those that Jesus just talked about, the ones who have not seen and yet have believed. Because there's a group of us who did see it. And we've written some things down, and I've written some things down here, John says, and I wrote these things down so that you might believe. So that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And that's my prayer as well. In doing these videos and talking through this with you is that in sharing these stories and in sharing some perspective and digging into John's gospel, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Here's what I'd like you to do. If you're willing to post something or email or send me a note, I want you to answer this question. And this is something I do every week. It's kind of a practice I picked up a couple of years ago. Every week I sit down and I journal. I did this morning, once a week, and I consider my being sent. Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. And I think about what it means for me to be sent. And specifically, I look back and I look forward. And when I look back, I ask this question: who was I sent to in the past week? And so I want you to answer that question if you can. If you're willing, consider it prayerfully, and then share with me and share with others if you're willing. Who were you sent to last week? What did it mean last week for you to be sent? As the Father sent Jesus, so he has sent you. And he opens possibilities, he opens conversations, he brings people into your life, sometimes the same people week after week, and sometimes new and different people. Who were you sent to last week as a missionary and as a member of God's church, as one empowered by the Holy Spirit to witness to Jesus? Who were you sent to? This is John chapter 20. We will wrap up tomorrow with John chapter 21.